I'd like to welcome everyone to our lecture with Mr. Jerry Woodfill today. I'd like to remind you also that if you do have a question during his lecture, go ahead and post it in the chat or post "I have a question," and during the Q&A at the end, we'll get to the questions for Jerry to answer in the order that they arrived. So anyways, this is Mr. Jerry Woodfill. He has over 55 years of experience here at the Johnson Space Center. And in his time here, he's done a lot of amazing things like designing the warning system that first alerted mission control to the life-threatening malfunction on the Apollo 13 spacecraft. And he also managed the Apollo 11 spacecraft alarm system and was monitoring it upon its arrival and descent on the moon. So he is a returning lecturer and often a favorite of the JSC interns, and he does have a very entertaining program for us today. So with that, Mr. Woodfill, go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, thank you for that great introduction, and I'm looking forward to sharing this program. You will be my first audience. This is one I haven't given before, and I appreciate all you interns because it gives me a chance to practice these things. And this is a program mainly about Apollo 13, but actually it includes my entire 55-year career. And so I like to play the guitar, you know, when you've been at a place 55 years. And I started out in the 50s, and of course 50s was the era of rock and roll. And so I have these songs. Here's one of my songs, and it's based on a song by Woody Guthrie, and it goes like this. Space is your place, space is my place. From the lunar craters to the Martian mountains, from the moons of Saturn to the stars of heaven. Space is here for you and me. So that's the idea. I want to share that space is here for me and you so we can be part of it. And so this program is my program about space. And now here's a disclaimer. This, as you read here on the screen, these are my reflections, and they're entirely my own, and I've changed the names to protect the innocent. And so what goes on here is not because anybody's reviewed it in depth for appropriateness or anything else. It's just things that I've encountered over my career. And so that's when I received the 50-year award. So if any of you guys stay around 50 years, NASA's still here 50 years from now, I'm sure it will be. That's the reward you'll get, or that's the plaque that you'll get. I've hung it in my office in Building 32. So these are a list of the 13 things that I want to share with you today. Around the perimeter of this particular slide, you see some of the things that I was involved in, of course, Apollo 13, and then on the lower left corner is a PAO Public Affairs had a interview from a magazine in England called Sky at Night, and they did a interview of me, and like I share often is I get interviewed because I'm still at Johnson Space Center. Now there are many people that did a lot more for Apollo, but they're retired, but I'm still here at my desk. So when they're looking for somebody to talk about Apollo, I'm the guy they can go to. Well, here's one of the first things. Everybody aspires to be, you know, a division chief or a branch chief or maybe director of Johnson Space Center, but I've never been any of those things. But I want to share with you that even if you don't reach that level, nevertheless, you got to have followers. Now I'm a follower, so I'm going to share the things that have meant a great deal to my career. It's helped other people because I want to be a terrific follower, okay? And here's some examples. Not too long ago, after, 54 years, Apollo 10, they were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 10 mission, which was the precursor to actually going to the moon. 2 months after Apollo 10 sort of practiced a landing, didn't land, but just kind of went near a landing 50 years before. Well, they wanted to celebrate that. And so Apollo 10, the lunar lander, was called Snoopy. And that's where the concept of the Snoopy, the Silver Snoopy Award came along. So it was a wonderful thing to actually be awarded the Silver Snoopy Award on the 50th anniversary, and by one of the astronauts that flew on Apollo 10. So at the lower left corner is my family, with the director of Johnson Space Center and others. Beside me is one of my sons. I have two sons, one's an attorney and one's a pastor. And to my left shoulder, that's my wife, Betty. We've been married, 53 years now, and I've been married NASA for 55 years. So these are examples. Here again, I've never been a branch chief or any kind of thing, but because if you're a follower and you do a good job, you'll be recognized. For example, on the right side of the screen, because of the work I contributed to Apollo 13, I got the same award that Gene Kranz got. That was the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And so quite a difference between Gene Kranz and Jerry Woodfill, but I'm sure he hangs that in his den like I hang that in my office, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Okay, there's going to be some challenges in your career, things that aren't going to go so well. And how you encounter them and how you deal with them is very important. And here's one of the biggest challenges I had, and it was something that I was so proud of. It was called the Space Educator's Handbook, and it's a site on the internet. And so they created a new group at Johnson Space Center. It was called the New Initiatives Office, and this was created in about 1989, a long time ago. But the idea of the group was that we were supposed to come up with new ideas and to use NASA technology in a way that had never been used before. So I came up with, I thought was a bright idea. It's called the Space Educator's Handbook. And so I thought, this project, I was such a low-level employee, and I didn't think it would cause any kind of a problem. But the problem was that I named it the Space Advocates Handbook. And my concept was to take all these free things that NASA produces, all these educational documents and all the astronaut backgrounds and everything, and I'd collect them and put them together in one document, digital document. I'd call it the Space Advocates Handbook. Now, the idea was that I was going to share all kinds of things that most people didn't know about NASA, one of which was I was going to share how representatives and congressmen, whether they were for or against NASA, is how they voted. That was a bad thing to do because by law, by NASA's charter, we're not supposed to do that kind of thing. So that was one of the many things that apparently I had not done right. And so it was like a high crime and misdemeanor. And unbeknownst to me, this was going to cause me a lot of difficulties in my career. So I was marched up to the top. I mean, not the Tower of London. I had to go up to the top floor of Building 1, and I had what they call closed door counseling. And there I was grilled on why I had done such an inappropriate thing. And so I tried to explain. I didn't really understand that it was inappropriate. I didn't know there was a rule or something that meant that I shouldn't have done it. And so there I was, and the
story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Now that's from a TV program about 55 years ago called Dragnet. It was about a group of detectives in Los Angeles, very popular black and white show on TV. And so I was like interrogated, and I was asked, and here I was, and I had no idea that what I'd done was improper. And so my thought, oh, this is the end of my career. I better start looking for.
You're fired.
Yeah, I'm going to get fired for this. And so while I was up there, it was in George, I think it was maybe George Abbey's, just outside George Abbey's office. He was the director of Johnson Space Center. And so I noticed when I was actually waiting to be consuled that this particular plaque was on the wall. And this is something I've never forgotten, and I've tried to make it one of my models in my career. So it's better to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though you're checkered by failure. Well, this is going to be a failure for me, to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy much nor suffer much because they live in a gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat. Well, apparently this was going to be a defeat more than a victory, but it kind of encouraged me when I read that. And it turned out it became a victory. Despite the fact that I had done this inappropriate thing, I was corrected. And the correction was, I was told that they were going to send over to my office a person from documentation services, and every single, I had created this thing in a program called HyperCard. Now that was an early Macintosh point and click kind of a program that you could put all kinds of content, digital images, and you put videos in it and so forth. And so you could create kind of a space encyclopedia. Well, the only thing was they had to send a person over there to see that every single card that I put in there was appropriate. So for 3 months, they went through this review of everything I'd done to make sure that it passed muster, and it did. Well, as a result of that, way back in the 1990s, I put on the internet this Space Educator's Handbook. And right now, this was something happened, I think last year, year before, somebody reviewing all the space sites, you know, the internet space sites, rated this thing, the Space Educator's Handbook, this thing that was going to get me into big trouble, as the second best, you know, international space site on the entire internet. So that's an example. I want to encourage you all that even when things look really dark and it doesn't look like you've done the right thing, if you know it's right, don't give up on yourself or what you've done, because this is an example where if you don't give up, something good can come of it. So here's another thing I learned from Apollo 13. If you're a minion, like I've always been, and you make your contribution, and sometimes you don't want to be too forthright about saying what you did and so forth is good or not, but there came a time when I had to speak up, and I couldn't have a small voice about this. And let me explain what it's all about. Okay, I was assigned the alarm system for Apollo, and as a result of that, we had a terrible thing that happened. We had, not because of my alarm system, but I worked with the astronauts, Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee, that were testing the very first Apollo spacecraft that would orbit the Earth, and they were going to orbit the Earth in 1967. But I was in a meeting in Los Angeles, and we were going over the warning system for their spacecraft, and Roger Chaffee and Ed White and Gus Grissom were the board that would finally accept the entire design and the construction of the spacecraft, and we were in Los Angeles. And on that particular week, I met Roger Chaffee, who was one of the rookie spacemen that would fly. They called it Apollo 1. That was the spacecraft 12, it was called. That would be the first Apollo spacecraft to be tested in Earth orbit. And so at that meeting, Roger and I discussed the alarm system, and he gave me some suggestions on things that would improve it. And so, of course, I took his suggestions and worked to get it into the system. And but just months later, I was having dinner. My wife and I, we'd been married, let's see, that had been 67. I was married, Betty and I were married in 66. So just about a year after married, we were having dinner at her aunt's apartment over there in the Heights, and the TV was on. I heard that there'd been some terrible thing that had happened at Cape Kennedy, and the Apollo 1 spacecraft had had a short circuit underneath Gus Grissom's couch while they were practicing things that they would do as they orbited in space. And what had happened, a dreadful fire ensued, and Roger, who I'd got to meet and admire and appreciate, he and Gus and Ed, they had all perished. And so as a result of that, because I was responsible for the alarm, turned out system couldn't have saved. There wasn't even a fire extinguisher on board, no way to put the fire out, and it was a short circuit under Gus Grissom's couch, so that started the fire. And yes, the alarms did come on, but what could you do? You had no way. The design was horrible, and you couldn't get the hatch open. It took 5 minutes. You had to put some kind of special tool to, and Ed White tried to reach behind himself to start the hood, but before that, in just less than a minute, they had been overcome by the smoke in the capsule. And so as a result of that, I was assigned to lead a group that would look at the alarm system for all the Apollo craft as well as the lunar landers. And so to do so, I would make weekly trips to Grumman, the manufacturer of what would be the Eagle, you know, the lunar lander. And after months and months of work, we had to come up with ways of making sure the alarm system would save astronauts' lives. One of the problems we had to deal with were nuisance alarms. And when you turn a system on, sometimes just the fact that it hasn't reached its quiescent state, it will ring an alarm. And so that can be a bad thing, because if you get in your car and you're driving, you know, up a mountain or something like, and suddenly some kind of alarm comes on, that's not a real problem. It's just a temporary problem. And so as the leader of that group, I had to, with the engineers at Grumman and then at NASA, we had to come up with assuring that nuisance alarms didn't cause a problem. And so we did all this work, and it was finally time we had to present it to Dr. Lowe, who was the head of the Apollo spacecraft program at Johnson Space Center. And this is my creation of what had happened when we made that presentation to Dr. Lowe. And we were going through it, and all of a sudden, one of the board members said, "I'm troubled about this. I'm troubled about this. I think we need to look into this further." Now here we were, and we had spent months of it. I had personally taken all these trips to Grumman, and we had visited every one of the subsystem managers for the lunar lander system and the command module system. And here, because of this one board member, and said, you know, this thing, the man couldn't have known how much we had done. And this was an injustice, I felt, you know, and I was just a minion. But I just couldn't stop. And so I got up, I said, "Mr. Lowe, it'd be wrong to start over. We have gone through it. We've been thorough on this. It would just be a waste of time to go over this again." And I walked out of the room, and I wondered if I'd have a job when I got back to my desk to speak so forthrightly and, you know, out of turn. But some of the guys in Flight Crew Support Division, the guys that work with the astronauts, engineers, they vouched for me, and they assured Mr. Lowe that we had done a great job on it, and they didn't change, and they went ahead and accepted all our changes to the alarm system. So that's the point I wanted to make of experience I had where I had to speak up, and generally, you know, as a lower level employee, I would never have done that, but I just felt overwhelmed that this was an injustice and something had to be said. Well, okay, this is the idea that it's much better to be proactive and make sure things work right, so that, you know, when you actually doing things, if you haven't been proactive, preparation is much better than application. Here's an example. Remember, I just told you about the alarm system. So one of the things that we had to correct, and that I did an engineering order, was I had to set the bus voltage that we had to detect a malfunction on the command module. Now, this meant that if you were actually traveling in space and all the systems were operating, there had to be what they call a threshold or a trip level where you had a problem, and you had to set that so that if it got below a certain level, you had to alert the astronauts and ring a master alarm, and then they'd hear in their headsets a warning tone. Well, one of the things I had come up with was setting the level for the main bus B undervolt as well as the main bus A. And I had worked with the actual electrical power system engineers to set that level. So here on, it was April 13th of 1970, and I had my headset on. I was monitoring Apollo 13. It was around 9 o'clock that evening. And all of a sudden I heard in my headset, Houston, we've had a problem. And that main bus be undervolt. It was one of the many things that we had to get right, had actually turned on the master alarm, and they had heard an explosion, but it was really because the main bus be undervolt on the caution warning system. My system had turned on an alarm that they said the words, Houston, we've had a problem. Houston, we said. So indirectly, I was responsible for that famous quote that, you know, is in when they made the movie Apollo 13, that was number 50 among the most famous movie quotes in the history of cinema. Houston, we've had a problem. So it was all a result of setting that main bus be undervolt. So I'd done a good job, and I've always been proud of that. So this is one I like to share. You know, people say, you know, I'm a spiritual guy. You know, I believe in God, and I believe that he, again, kind of leads the course of our lives. And I often share things about what he has done in my life and then for the NASA program. But if you kind of don't want to say too much about God, you just call it luck or good fortune or something like that. Where I see it's God's providence. And so I did a series on the internet. If you go to the internet and Google my name, Jerry Woodfill, and there's a thing called 13 Things That Saved Apollo 13. If you put that in your Google search engine, 13 Things That Saved Apollo 13. So in looking at all the things that were responsible for the rescue of Apollo 13, I couldn't help but begin to understand it was more than just luck. These things, there were just too many of them. You know, if you take the probability of this many things happening in the right way, it had to be more than luck. You had to have there had to be somebody behind that. And that's what I call God's providence. So this is a list of them. And look at the list here. I mean, it's unbelievable. I didn't want to do that. The explosion, it happened at just the right time. It happened about midway between the Earth to the moon. And if it had happened much earlier, the explosion in the command ship, or if it happened much later when the lunar lander had actually departed from the moon, we couldn't have saved their lives. It happened in 55 hours and 55 minutes into the mission, a time when we could still save their lives. The tank that exploded, there was a tank that exploded in the service module, and the tank was at the perimeter service module. And because it was at the outside, when it blew off, it blew the panel that was covering it in the service module into space. Now, tank one was in the interior. If tank one had been the one that exploded, they would have lost their lives right there, because if tank one, the interior tank exploded, it would have taken out tank two. There's hydrogen tanks above tank 1 and 2, and the whole thing would just become a like a comet or something in space. Now, the other thing is, when they tried to, the astronauts thought that they had a problem with the command ship. When they heard that explosion, they thought that they'd been struck by a meteor. So they were going to do the wrong things. They couldn't find any damage in their capsule, so they thought that the damage must be something struck the lunar lander. And they had, when they tried to close the hatch of the lunar lander, it wouldn't close. Now, can you imagine? That hatch was designed by the finest, mechanical engineers on the planet. It wouldn't close. And so suddenly they knew they had to get into the lunar lander, and it's good that it wouldn't work, because that was their rescue ship. The guy that was actually the navigator for Apollo 13 was Jim Lovell. And it's interesting that Jim Lovell had been on Apollo 8. Remember, that was the one that circled the moon on Christmas Eve and day of 1968. Well, Lovell was the navigator, and he was now the commander of Apollo 13. And the things that he did to navigate Apollo 8 back to Earth would really be needed for Apollo 13. Now, isn't that interesting? That the same guy that did it on 8 would be on 13. That can't be luck. There's got to be some kind of a providential thing going on. This is another one that people ask me about. Jack Swigert, because Charlie Duke's the 10th man on the moon, a friend of mine. Well, Jack Swigert had worked with Charlie but Charlie had also worked with Ken Manning. Well, Charlie got the measles from his child. And he exposed Ken, who was supposed to be the pilot of the command module on Apollo 13. Ken was exposed. He had no antibodies. So they said, well, Jack, you're in backup crew and you've got antibodies. You won't get the measles. You've had them. So they made Jack the pilot. Well, now Ken's a great engineer and a great astronaut and so forth. But Jack, because Apollo 13, when it exploded, the cooling system, the heating system and all that, they didn't have enough power to make it warm or anything. And Jack Swigert was a football player from the University of Colorado. So he was the perfect guy to put in the coldest part of the Apollo 13 craft because he was brawny. And the other thing about Jack was he was the astronaut that knew more about the alarm system than any of the other astronauts. So he was a good replacement. And these things are all in the 13 things that saved Apollo 13. So I can't go through them all. We only have an hour to do this program, but these are some of the things. It can't be luck. It's got to be, there's a hand of God's providence up. Here's another thing about I've
Mr.
learned.
Woodville?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like your webcam. Yeah, there we go. Now we can see your face. Beforehand, we were seeing your keyboard. There we go.
Okay. Hey, you can actually see my face. Well, since you can see me, let me show you. I got my, my Snoopy on, and then I got this NASA hat. I haven't worn it too much, but I can wear it here. You can actually see my face as well as the PowerPoint screen.
Your face is much smaller, but yes, we can.
You can see it. Well, that's nice. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know you could see my face. Gee whiz. Okay.
You look great.
That's wonderful. Okay, so here we are, being outspoken and we're very equal to be observant and peaceable. Well, I'm the latter. I'm more observant and peaceable. But there's some folks, you'll meet them in your career with the Johnson Space Center, and I met them, of course, over the years. And there was one fella that was unusually outspoken. And this guy's name was Don Arabian. And just months ago, he passed on at the age of 95 years of age. And Don was very loud and very outspoken. And he was responsible for what we called the mission evaluation room. Now, to me, the mission evaluation room should have been called the mission engineering room. Now, we have a mission evaluation room for the space station and so forth. But back in the 1960s, the mid 1960s, the mission evaluation room was in building 45 on the 3rd floor. And so Don was responsible for all that. And the mission evaluation room in that day, I guess it probably is today too, we were the engineers that actually were the designers, the people that followed all the Apollo spacecraft systems through tests and all the changes that had to be made because of different problems that we had. And so I call it the mission engineering room. Now, in those days, I guess you still have, they call it the mission MOCR. Mission Operations Control Room, MOCR. Well, I like to think of the Apollo Mission Evaluation Room as the MECR, the Mission Engineering Control Room, because for most missions, we were simply looking over the backs of the flight controllers, but for Apollo 13, because of all the problems that came up, we had to actually solve those problems because they'd never been seen before. And Don was our leader. And one of the big problems, of course, was the problem they had with filter. And remember the square filters on the command ship when the Apollo 13 command module, service module exploded, they didn't have enough, they didn't have enough of filters. See my round filter here? I don't know what you can see.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. Well, the problem, of course, was that this vehicle, the lunar lander, didn't have enough of these round filters to make it back to Earth after the explosion. They were losing this as the rescue ship. And so there were plenty of filters on in this thing right here, if I can find one. There it is. Oh, can we get it out of my... I get all these props down here on the floor, and I have a prop here that is... Where are you? Well, there he is. I can pull you out of here. I'm still here. Ah! Okay, that's the command ship. We got the scale a little bit long here. That's not the right scale, but nevertheless, there weren't enough filters for this ship, and there were plenty of the square filters for the command ship, but that system wouldn't work. So how do you, the story is, how do you make the square filter fit into the round receptacle in the lunar lander? And of course, the mission evaluation room that I was responsible for the alarm system, we came up with the solution. By the way, Don, the guy you see on the screen, I put a kind of a picture of his mouth there, but Don, that's what I look like. Hey, you see me on the screen now, and that's what I look like. I was a handsome dude, wasn't I, way back there in 1969? But that's what I used to look like, and when I worked in the mission evaluation room, and it was a pretty technical facility, and we weren't like flight controls. That is, we see those TVs that are on their stands. That was what we had to use to see the measurements that were coming back from the command ship and the lunar lander. And if you also notice that we had telephones, that's how we communicate. We didn't even have the headsets that had the speakers on them. That flight controllers had that, but we just had headsets, and we had to use a telephone to talk to anybody. So there we were. And so how did we figured out the way of making the square filter here work in the round system? And the Don called me into his office, says, Jerry, your alarm system, the CO2 light keeps coming on. And that was the first alert that they had the problem with too much carbon dioxide. The levels of the percentage of carbon dioxide in the cabin were getting to the point where, had it not been the alarm system that rang the CO2 alarm and showed the alarm light, if you've seen the movie Apollo13, you see that the alarm light come on, and if you wouldn't have had that alarm come on, or the instrumentation tell you had too much carbon dioxide, the astronauts would have got drowsy and fallen asleep and maybe not live. But because of instrumentation, we were able to detect that they had a real problem. And so they tell me, your alarm system keeps ringing this alarm. Well, yeah, I said, the alarm system's working right. It should be ringing alarms. The percentage of carbon dioxide, 15 millimeters of mercury, is way too high. He said, well, what do we do about it? I said, no, I don't fix things. I'm the guy that tells you got a problem. Somebody else has to fix it. Well, they came up with a solution. One of our guys in the group of crew systems guys, Ed Smiley, I think the name was, came up, and here was the way they did it. They took the square filters, and they took plastic bags we had on board for moon rocks and suit parts and everything. And then we took I got this at Toys R Us. We took the filter, and they had a fan on board so that you could use the hose out of that fan and blow the cabin atmosphere through the bag, and we put the filter at the mouth of the bag. And the only thing is, you see the thing's going to leak. It's going to leak because it doesn't. Well, the reason we were able to save their lives is because we had duct tape. You had duct tape on board, and we could use that to make sure that there was a good seal around that square filter. And so because of that, I wrote a song about this, and it's my song about duct tape, and it goes like this. Well, their spaceship exploded 200,000 miles in space, and too few round CO2 filters meant death was in their face. But the damaged mothership had plenty that were square. But how do you make a square filter fit into a round hole? Was their prayer. So they looked around that spaceship to find a way day and found something that just might work that day. No rocket science needed for this device. An old roll of duct tape would work very nice. You got to use what you have faith and believe. 'Cause the things in life are all free to receive. Failure's no option when problems show up. Everything level, thank God for everything. Thank you, duct tape. That's what saved their lives. Duct tape. Okay. And going on. And so here's the next thing. Failure is not an option, and failure is an option are really opposites. And I want to give two examples. Of course, with Apollo 13, failure wasn't an option, and the quote, failure is not an option, comes from really not Gene Kranz, although Gene personified it thoroughly, but from a friend of mine named Jerry Bostic. And Jerry and I were good friends through church. We both went to the Methodist Church over in Clear Lake City, and Jerry's son, Michael, was in my Sunday school class. And Jerry was the superintendent of the 11 o'clock Sunday school, and I did 9:30. And so when they wrote a book, Jim Lovell wrote a book about Apollo 13 called Lost Moon. And he, Michael, Jerry's son, went to work for Ron Howard. And Ron Howard were making movies. And Jerry's son, Michael, my Sunday school student at one time, said, Ron, there's a book out. Jim Lovell wrote it. My dad worked at Jerry Bostic. Mike's dad worked on Apollo 13. He says, they make a good movie. And so that's the reason that the movie was created, Apollo 13. And wonderful movie. 90% of it's accurate. Now, there's some liberties that they took with it, but for 90% of it's accurate. And so when they made the movie, Ron Howard's team and, of course, the leading actor, Tom Hanks, they all came to Johnson Space Center, and they actually came by my laboratory. It was the integration IGO laboratory, and it was in Building 9. And unfortunately, I wasn't there at the time, but they showed Ron and Tom Hanks how they do animations and things like that. And as a result of that, they invited Jerry Bostic, because he was Mike's father. The makers of the movie interviewed Jerry Bostic, who had really done a great job. Jerry was the officer that was responsible for doing a lot of the things through the trajectory analysis and work on Apollo 13. And so they asked Jerry, well, Jerry, was there ever a time where you just got to the point where it just almost had to throw up your hands? I mean, there was nothing you could do. And Jerry looked at him and said, look, we put all the options on the table, the things that we could do, and failure wasn't one of them. All those options would succeed. And Bill Broyles, I think, and the other guy that interviewed Jerry said, that's it. That's going to be the tagline for the film Apollo 13, failure is not an option. So that's really how that whole saying came into be. It was because of Jerry Bostic. And so this is my point. There was a very sad thing that happened. And of course, that's, more recent, Apollo 13 or Apollo 1 even. And there have been 3 missions where we lost lives. And of course, the Challenger, and then the Columbia. And one of the things with the Columbia was that if you have studied how that whole mechanism of that failure, the mechanism of the failure was that during ascent, during launch, there was insulation on the outside of the external tank of the shuttle that peeled off. And it peeled off and it struck the leading edge of the left wing of the orbiter. And because of the lightness of, it was thought because of the light weight of the sloughing insulation, that it really couldn't have been a problem, but it's one of those things. It was an option. It could have been a problem. And so there were opportunities where it could have been for sure made assurance that it wasn't going to be a problem. And one of those was that there was a Air Force camera, I think it was in New Mexico, it could have taken a picture of actually the Challenger's wing, even from, you know, Earth, and could have showed evidence of there being a problem with that wing. Also, there was the opportunity they could have done something, and he actually done an EVA and checked it. So after the loss of life of the Columbia crew, I wondered, you know, I remember I was in the library at San Jacinto College while my wife was working one evening, and I said, I'm going to just see about this. So I went through an analysis. What if we knew there was a problem and we found out about it? Could we have still saved the Columbia crew? And it went through all the consumables on board. You know, it was just kind of a back of the envelope kind of thing. And you said, you know, I really believe we could have saved them, because we could have done the same things to save Apollo 13's crew, extending the life of systems and all that we could have done for the Columbia. Well, I thought, well, maybe this is my speculation. Well, when they went through the entire investigation and put out the report on the Columbia tragedy, they had analyzed everything and says, yes, had we known about the problem with that left wing, we could have stayed in orbit and there was a means of rescuing them. So that's my point here. Failure really was an option for Columbia, and Apollo 13, the thoroughness of everything succeeded in bringing those guys back alive. So, you know, here again, I'm as much responsible for what happened on Columbia as anybody was. So I'm, you know, responsible as well as I was responsible for Apollo 1's thing. So it's just a collective thing that all of us are sad about. I wanted to share that with everybody. Okay, now this is why Gene Kranz's attitude is so important. We got to work the problems thoroughly. We can't just guess at anything. That's one of the greatest things that came out of Apollo 13 and Apollo 1 was that Gene made this called the Gene Kranz dictum, that's failure is not an option, but don't guess. Make sure that we know what the solution is. Okay, the gravest, most humiliating failure can birth the greatest excesses. Let's see, what time it's getting along. I'm going to have to kind of hustle along. I'm taking too much time for you guys. Well, here's an example from my career. And I was the high school valedictorian in my high school, but I went on to have the lowest grade ever made at Rice University in differential equations. So here I was from the top. I went from the top to the bottom, and it looked like I wasn't going to even graduate from Rice University, because as a high school basketball player, I had one miracle game. I scored 20 points against probably the greatest high school defensive player that ever played Hoosier basketball. His name was Bobby Cantrell. And there's a picture in the top right side of the screen of me. I'm 30, number 30, as a senior in high school. We're playing Bobby, and the guy that is closest to me is 6'7" tall. The guy that was guarding me is Bobby Cantrell over his left shoulder. And Bobby was such a good defensive player that he went on to University of Michigan. They made it to the Final Four, and Bobby held the leading college player in the nation to 11 points. Well, in that one game in high school, the fourth game of the state tournament, I scored 20 points against Bobby. I had a miracle game. I was like Superman in jockey shorts. I couldn't be stopped. Based on that one ball game, the coach at Rice University had a relative that lived in my part of Northwest Indiana that sent that picture and the statistic from that one game to the coach of Rice University. And based on that one ball game, one ball game, and the statistics, I got a full basketball scholarship to Rice University. It was the only offer I had, so I couldn't very well refuse it. And so I like to share that with each one of you to let you know there can be one thing that can happen that can set the whole course of your life. When things don't look like they're going right, one thing can happen that can change everything. And that's the thing that changed me. And that's why I'm giving you this talk right now, because of that one basketball game. But at Rice, you see the lower right? That's not me, but it's an example of how I played at Rice University. And I made the lowest shooting percentage ever made by any Rice player, one shot in 18 attempts in the varsity. And the one shot I made was actually a bad pass over our center's hands at Baylor University. I threw a pass, it went over his hands, and I made a bad pass. That's the only shot I ever made. So, okay, so these are failures, right? These are failures. But as a result of that failure, I gave up the babe of basketball. John Kennedy came to Rice Stadium, and I give that speech often. I don't have to give it at night, but I memorized it, and I give it a lot of times when I go out because it so changed my life. And he said in that speech, we do this thing that is trying to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Well, getting a degree at Rice University playing basketball as well was pretty hard. And I thought to myself after hearing the president, if we can go to the moon, I can graduate. So I gave up basketball, focused on academics, and I made a B average my final 2 years at Rice University, and I graduated. And NASA came out and interviewed me, and they never asked me about my lowest grade ever made. See that? That's the lowest grade never made in the lower left in differential equations at Rice. And that was my report card. So as a result of that, I got a job with NASA, and I was immediately assigned the alarm system for the command module. And just a few weeks later, I also was assigned the alarm system for the lunar lander. And so had not I been such a failure in basketball at Rice, I may not have given up the game and graduated. So I did pass eventually differential equations. Okay, this is one of the things I like to share, is that the greatest engineer is one that can solve the most complex problem. Now, you know, remember Rube Goldberg, and here's an example of a Rube Goldberg. Very complex, it gets the job done, but it's way too complex. But the best engineer is one that can come up with the easiest solution for the toughest problem. And here's an example. Not too long ago, my bathroom sink was plugged up, and I was going to think, oh man, I'm going to have to take all the plumbing apart and everything. But I went to the Dollar Tree, and they had this thing for $1. This thing cost $1, and it was this long thing you could stick down. You didn't even have to remove the stopper on the drain. You just stick it down and pull it back and forth. And that's all I did. I stick it down, pull it. You know, if I had a plumber come out, it would cost $100, but it was the simple solution to a complex. It worked perfectly. Well, that's why we beat the Soviets to the moon, because an engineer came up with the best way to go into the moon. Don't use a single vehicle, but use a lander and then a command ship to orbit the moon. It was called the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous design. And that got us to the moon first because it was the simplest solution to a complex problem. And it's so simple that people say, well, that's so simple, I could have thought of that. Well, why didn't you then? And here's an example. We were trying to test the lunar lander at Bethpage in the factory, and there was electromagnetic interference. And you can't have, on the power buses, you can't have this ripple of interference going on, because it could follow everything up. It could follow your communication system up. It could even get into the guidance system. So they couldn't pass this test. And so there was this very bright doctor in Bethpage, and they called him in. He was renowned to be able to figure out the most complex problem. And he came in and he thought about it. And he said, turn off the lights. Well, they turned off the lights and ran the test, and lo, everything was fine. It was simple. Electromagnetic interference was coming from, I guess, the power system with the lights or something. And it just That was it. It wasn't a problem with the lunar lander. It was something external to the lander. There aren't lights, above you on the moon or anything. And so they said, well, what do we owe you? He said, well, taxi fare, about $10, $12. He says, but for telling you to turn off the lights, that's $10,000. And so that's an example. It's the brightest idea can be worth a lot more than just plugging and grinding through everything. And here's an example from my life. My garage door wouldn't work right. And so I called the Sears repairman to come in, and he got under my garage door opener, and he said some kind of a incantation, abacadabacazoo or something like that. And then he said, okay, Mr. Woodfill. And he did something. He did a little dance around the garage and everything. And he pushed the switch and worked perfectly. I said, what did you do? He says, well, the circuit that it's a circuit between a lighted part of the garage door and a sensor on the other side. You had some grass clippings down here, and I simply, by dancing around, removed those grass clippings. So there was a complex problem. It took a simple solution, but if I'd have known that, I'd just saved myself $100. Now, this is a good one. This is one that I often share. And a lot of things that are just wonderful examples of coming up with a very easy solution. Don't give credit to the person, the minion that came up with the solution. And I asked one of the very prominent flight controllers one time on Apollo about that. And his comment was, well, the one fella, he came up with the idea, but it took 3 or 4 levels of supervision to prove the idea. Somehow that didn't comfort me too much. That the approvers were equal to the guy that came up with the idea. Somehow that didn't satisfy the explanation. But anyway, here's an example. This thing, I told you about the square filter and the round thing. Well, there's 2 engineers that I work quite a bit with. Gary Johnson, of course, you may have met Gary. He's works for one of the reliability contractors now, and he had a very high-level job at Johnson Space Center. And another friend of mine that worked in an office in Building 15 down from me, who was responsible for the electrical power system for the lunar lander. So Gary and Art came up with this idea, and Gary worked with him, that if you didn't have power in the entry batteries to the command module, those emergency batteries, you didn't have the fuel cells anymore because it was separated from the service module. How could you re-enter the atmosphere if you didn't have your battery power for the emergency batteries? Well, on Apollo 13, that they had lost that emergency battery power because they had to use it to keep the ship alive while they were trying to analyze what had happened, because the command ship wouldn't keep power up, so they had to use those emergency batteries without having the fuel cells and the system that the exploded tank had taken out. So Art had come up with this idea a year before that happened, how you could jumper charge power from the lunar lander through a wire to make it work with charge up the emergency batteries. And so on Apollo 13, when they needed that problem, Art and Gary worked together with the Grumman and the North American Rockwell engineers, and they came up with the procedure to charge up those batteries to save the Apollo 13 crew as they re-entered. Wonderful idea, but somehow Art and Gary were just forgotten, and it was their idea. They worked through the whole thing. In fact, I've seen about 6 people take credit for it. And but this was the last straw. I watched the movie Apollo 13, and in the movie they give credit to it to Ken Mattingly working, in the movie Apollo 13, he's working in the simulator. So Ken Mattingly in the movie. Now Ken wasn't responsible for this. This was the Apollo 13 producers, directors. They wanted to make this into a better story, and so Ken says in the movie, in fact, I got this the other day off of the movie. I played it out. I had the VHS copy of it, and I actually took a picture of the screen, and that's Ken saying, draw 4 amps from the LEM batteries to charge the command module batteries. Oh, what an injustice. but you know, I've let you all know it was Art Campus and Gary Johnson were the real heroes of that. Okay, so okay, individualism is important. Of course, we know Michael Jordan did so much, but it really takes a team to win the championship. Okay, so this is the one I've already given you this demonstration about.
Yeah, it's termites. Oh, get rid of them. Oh, no, I'm not an exterminator. I'm a pest monitor. I only let you know when there's a problem. There's a problem. All right, you guys take care.
Did you hear that?
Bye.
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, well, that's an example. I was the guy like the exterminator. You know, I knew that I told you I had a problem, but I didn't fix it. Okay, and of course I went through this. I don't know. Can you see the? See, I can see the video, but you all, I don't know if the videos work when you use the Teams.
Yeah, we can see it.
You saw the video?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Okay, now this is one. Here's another one that sometimes you wonder, you know, how come this person, this man or woman, she got promoted or he got promoted, and I do just as well, but I never got promoted. Okay, so sometimes it's nothing because of them or you. It's just some chance thing that happened, some opportunity that happened where circumstance didn't give you that opportunity, but gave somebody else the opportunity. Okay, so this is an example. Okay, it's like fishing. You know, maybe you've got your hook down there, but the fish doesn't bite on your hook. Okay, I'm working on Apollo 13. At the same time the explosion happened, I had my headset on. You know, my warning system alerted them that they had a problem. Gene Kranz, of course, is got his set on, and you know he's really working through to make the problems. I'm just a low level guy, and he's you know the top man. I mean he's really probably better known than anybody, even almost as well known as you know, first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong. So and because his personality and his example is so great. And so, but here's the example, you know, look at this. This is an example. If Gene sold his Apollo, you know, 13 badge, $29,000. And mine at best is worth $1.50, and I still have it, by the way. And so there's an example, you know, but you know, each one of us can play just as big a role as a team member as the leader of the team. That's my point here. Okay, accidents happen for a reason. How do you like that for an Okay, of course I said to Houston, we've had a problem. I've probably already said enough about that. But here's another thing. Even though those guys perished in that fire, after the fire, what happened was I was responsible for the panels as well as the alarm system. So one of the things I had to do is work with North American to make sure the panels were moisture proof. That is, we put some kind of silvery putty kind of stuff behind the panels. So if you had a short circuit, it would not cause a fire like it did on Apollo 1. And of course, had we not done that on Apollo 13, the vehicle had been, you know, in space with low power on. And so the breath from the astronauts would have created, when they turned power back on, it would have precipitated panels, and likely without that encapsulating material on all the contacts that were exposed, they would have had a fire like they did on Apollo 1, on Apollo 13. So in effect, the lives of those guys were lost on Apollo 1, but the fix actually saved the lives of the Apollo 13 astronauts. So, okay, this is the benefits of you've learned the lessons. It's beneficial. I've been able to share them for myself and as well as for you guys. So your careers are going to be just like mine. There'll be things that happen, and it doesn't hurt to have a little logbook of things that you're going through in your lives, you know, especially now as you're just starting out. Some of the things that you encountered, you don't have to share them with anybody, but write them down. You know, 50 years from now, somebody could ask you to give a talk like I'm sharing with you about what has been beneficial in your career. And so as the final slide of this program, I have this. So all of you that are still awake, if you're still there, here's what I want to ask you to do. I'm going to give you this honorary Apollo 13 flight controller pledge. And if you'll say after me, can you turn on your microphones now? Okay. And I'm going to give the pledge and you're going to say after me, and I'm going to make you an official Apollo 13 honorary flight controller. All right? Okay. Is anybody's mic on?
I'm not sure how this will sound, but we could try it.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. If you do the pledge with me, I've got 3,000 wristbands out there in the garage. One side of the wristband says failure is not an option. The other side says I have the right stuff. So I have 3,000. When I go out and give live presentations at the end of the show, I always do this oath. So like I always do, we're going to do it with you guys. And I got these wristbands and I give you a card. This is the card you get, and then I sign it. You can put your name in there as an honorary Apollo 13 flight controller. Now I have thousands of these cards as well. And somehow we need to come up with a way that I can let you guys pick them up or something. Maybe we can figure out a way to do that, but I want you each to have one of the wristbands and the card. Here's the pledge. Okay. Hand over the heart. Hand over the heart. Okay, here we go. Are you ready? I guess you're ready. I'll put my Apollo NASA hat on here to make it look real official. Okay, here's how it goes. I'll say the word, then you say after me. I will do my best.
I will do my best.
My best.
To achieve success in my goals.
To achieve success in my goals.
Neither fear.
Neither
fear,
Failure nor frustration.
failure nor frustration
Shall overcome me.
shall overcome me.
me.
I am unstoppable.
I am unstoppable,
Unmovable.
unmovable,
And unshakable.
and unshakable.
Failure is not an option.
Failure is
not
not
an
an option.
I have the right stuff.
I have the right stuff.
And you guys got it, especially if you've seen my program all the way through. I thank you for the opportunity to share with you. So Godspeed to all of you, and have a great Christmas, Happy New Year, and a wonderful career. God bless.
Thank you so much, Mr. Woodfill. That was absolutely amazing. And I think we expect to see Apollo 13, the musical, here sometime in the future.
That'll be great. Maybe the next time I'll be able to give it live to all you guys in Building 30's room, okay? So we'll look forward and hope that comes to pass. But it's been great sharing it once more with everybody. So as I say, Godspeed and have a great holiday. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. You too. Bye.